as well. Dr. Terence Farrell has a PhD in economics in 1979 from the University of Toronto, an LLB from the University of London and the LBC, Hugh Wooding Law School, a former central bank deputy governor. He has worked for regional companies in the media and information, technology, insurance, and media. A certified mediator, he's also a fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance in Trinidad and Tobago and a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. He is director of several private companies. There we went. Where did it go? Oh, there we go. He has served on government-appointed companies addressing various public policy issues, including the Vision 2020 core group. He was part of the core group, the task force on a future of BWIA, the State Enterprise Review Committee, the Economic Development Advisory Board, and he is a member of the National Advisory Committee on Constitutional Reform. He has published several scholarly articles in economics and has authored many books. Central Banking in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the books, The Underachieving Society, Development Policy and Strategy in Trinidad and Tobago, and We Like It So, The Cultural Roots of Trinidad, of Economic Underachievement in Trinidad and Tobago, and co-edited Caribbean Monetary Integration 1994. Over the last 10 years, he has contributed to over 100 opinion pieces to national and regional newspapers and presented to numerous organizations in the public and private sector. Good evening, Terence, Dr. Farrell. Oh, I didn't realize my video was off. All right. So, and then we have Mrs. Marla Dukaran, is an economist and no stranger to the department as well, and advisor specializing in the Caribbean strategic recommendations on over 25 Caribbean nations. She's recognized for delivering objective analysis, engaging presentations, and for influencing public policy and private sector decisions. Additionally, Mrs. Dukaran is actively building coalitions to resolve the injustices of discriminatory policies such as the European Union's black lists. Good evening, Marla.
Good evening, Dr. Khan.
And of course, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will invite questions after the presenters have presented. They have about 10 to 15 minutes each. Once the presenters have finished speaking, then we would invite questions from the general audience. Feel free to use the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask questions when that time comes. We plan on ending around 8:30, so we'll be with you for about an hour and a half. Right, and I'll probably place that in the chat record, if you can place that in the chat as well. All right, so now we will have a listen to Professor Roger Hussein.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Darren, are you all hearing me?
Yes.
Good. So I would focus a bit on how we got here in terms of someone's mic is on in the background. I would focus on how we got here and how we could use the guidance from economic theory to try to navigate our way out. Now, I see quite a bit of students online. I was able, Darren, to get onto some of the postgraduate students just in time for this seminar. So I see quite a bit of them online, the master's class, and I'm really pleased about that. And this is some of what they will be seeing in the short to medium term period to deal with. Now, let's treat the point A as 1996. Can something be done about that background noise, Rebecca? So in 1996, we had two goods produced, a non-tradable good and a tradable good. And at that point in time, we had a significant coming on stream of natural gas so that the economy was able to produce more natural gas intensive commodities, other things constant. And so the economy drifted from a point such as A in production space to a point such as B, where it produced significantly more tradable goods. So you move from T0 to T1 with, in a hypothetical case, a decline in the amount of non-tradable goods produced from NT0 to NT1. To move from the hypothetical to the real world, it's more like a point such as C, where instead of Trinidad and Tobago producing this vast increase in possible tradable goods from T0 to T1, it actually produced T0 to T2. Because
Prof, excuse, could you just put your presentation on presentation mode, please?
Yes,
so
no
the
problem.
audience can see it a little clearer.
Yeah, so and then we
thanks.
From a point such as T1 to T2, or from B to C, where as compared to the point A, you had an increase in natural gas production, in tradable goods production from T0 to T2, which is less than T1, but still considerably more than T0. But you had also an increase in the production of non-tradable goods. Now, when moving from B to C, B would be like Rebecca, can something be done about that background noise, please? In moving from B to C, B is hypothetically around 2003, 4, 5, 6. And C is more like 2012, 2013, 2014. As you can see at the point C, it was not a stable point. In fact, because of government involvement in the economy and intervention and the massive increase in transfers and subsidies in particular, and the change in the structure of production influenced by the change in the value of the real effective exchange rate and the change in the distribution of employment in the economy, we found that the economy drifted from C to D, motivated in part by the impact of transfers and subsidies on the labor force participation rate. In fact, in 2003, the labor force participation rate was about 63.4%, and by 2016, 2017, it had dropped significantly below 60%. In fact, as we speak, it's about 54.6%. But the economy did not stay at a point such as D, which is at around 2014, 2013, 2015, thereabouts, because at that point, two significant changes took place in the economy, and none of these things are sharp, exact changes. They are transitional changes. They are slow and across a period of time. And the two significant changes are an influx of about 100,000 Venezuelans, according to some sources, and a decline in natural gas production. So the economy gradually drifted away from D towards E, where when you have 100,000 or thereabouts Venezuelans on your shore, of which only about 16,525 are registered, and the majority are unregistered, they work in the background, they work in the informal non-tradable sector, and you have an enhancement in the amount of informal non-tradable sector goods produced, so that the economy, as we speak, is somewhere at a point such as E, producing T3 units of tradable goods, which involves significantly less natural gas intensive goods, and NT3 units of non-tradable goods. Now, why say all of this? The point E is not a good point. The point E is associated with a vast miscellany of poor outcomes for Trinidad and Tobago economy. It's associated with a low labor force participation rate, a skewed structure of production in favor of non-tradables, a skewed structure of exports, in that point E is an import-intensive point that perversely affects the stock of foreign exchange. It's associated for other reasons as well, not due to the structure of production, with a murder level that is the highest in recorded history. It's associated with an elevated price level as compared to 2015. I could point out about 40 variables, all of which between the point D and E has worsened in the Trinidad and Tobago economy. The real challenge of governance and the government in Trinidad and Tobago is how do we get to a point such as F? A point such as F that includes more tradable goods production. In this case, that would be a significantly larger amount of non-booming tradable manufacturing and agriculture and service exports and so on. And this is where I thought the Economic Development Advisory Board was taking the economy and was playing a really solid role, Terence. I mean, on the seminars where you are not on, I constantly make the case for the re-establishment of the EDAB. Of course, nobody listens, but I still make the argument. And so it's a point such as F that we really should be working together in the same direction. I can tell you that I am not seeing any policy measure of substantive value on the table that will take us towards point F. And as long as we keep the Venezuelan unregistered, we would find it difficult to move away from point E. Now, this is here the structure of the output of the Trinidad and Tobago economy in terms of growth performance from 2016 to 2023. We are ranked in the top 10 worst performing economies in the world, not surprisingly, because of the structure of production and in the change in the production level of some of our main comparative advantage goods. And I mean, next week, teaching starts at the university, and the most agonizing thing is to stand in front of a bunch of new students who ask you, well, where the money gone? I mean, here you see real GDP in 1990 base year, what the level was in 2008, where it is in 2024, after producing almost 8 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent. And the students would want to know, well, what accounts for this? What did you seniors do with our money? Where did the money go? And I mean, sometimes I have nothing that I could say to them. I just have to stay quiet. And here we see that we embraced a policy where we run huge non-energy fiscal, a huge non-energy fiscal balance. In fact, we have this, I don't want to say crazy, but we have this strategy in Trinidad and Tobago where we extract all the energy revenues and spend it out. There is no understanding of the intertemporal dynamics. There is no understanding of the Hamiltonian principle. We just extract the revenue and spend it out. One could even hypothetically say that the money in the HSF is borrowed money. So by way of a process of transfers and subsidies, we have basically spent out all the energy revenues in some regards. In fact, if you look at the ratio of transfers and subsidies to capital injections, you would see that our transfers and subsidies as a proportion of capital injections has been growing substantively, and in an economy that is at full employment with vast amount of underemployment, that's not the direction we should be going. Now, the substantive problem in the economy, the Rybak-Zinski problem in the economy, is that our employment of non-booming tradable sector workers, which I would classify as manufacturing, export, agriculture, tourism, and service exports, as a proportion of non-tradable workers, which is like malls and casinos and government employment and all those other type of areas, has been falling, whilst real output per worker relatively in the non-booming tradable as a proportion of the tradable, non-tradable sector has been rising. That's the classic asymptotic stagnancy problem that is going to continue to choke all development options in this country and make foreign exchange a perennial problem unless we fix the nature of the dynamics in a graph such as this. And as you can see here, and I've raised this with the banking sector, we embarked on a strategy where we finance an increase in non-tradable sector loans, and as non-tradable sector loans as a percent of total loans increased, well, given the low productivity in that sector, real GDP eventually crashed, although there were other factors. It is associated with a slowdown in real economic growth. And if you look at the inverse, if you take non-booming tradable sector loans as a percent of total loans, you would see that as that increases, real GDP growth increases. And so because non-booming tradable sector loans as a percent of total loans is low and on the decline in Trinidad and Tobago, no doubt the consequence is a low level of real GDP. When you look at Trinidad and Tobago growth performance across like countries in like small countries across the globe, you will see that we had one of the worst growth performance. And if you look at so I keep searching for where we could get some foreign exchange. I know Marla and Terence will take a slightly different angle. Our remittances, our average annual remittance is very poor in relation to other countries. And I think That you hear absolutely nothing, in my opinion, from the government at all on how we could pursue a greater amount of diaspora funding and an increase in annual remittances flow. And I think that's a low-hanging fruit. And also, we need to do some more as regards food imports. I mean, if you look at the relationship between employment and agriculture and the food import bill, which is now at about $8 billion, the relationship is clear that we need to do some more there. So moving forward, I just made some suggestion as to how we need to look at manufacturing and agriculture, how we could look at tourism, and how we could look at remittances to enhance the stock of foreign exchange flows, and in particularly in relation to the first three, Darren, move us from the point E, where I started, to the point F. I think all the conversations in this country really needs to be, of the form, Darren, how are you today? Good afternoon. What are we doing to move from point E to point F? Full stop. That's how I see it. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share those opening remarks. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that, Professor Hussein. I think next on the flyer is Rebecca, Mrs. Dukaran.
Yes, Mala is next.
Yes. Over to you, Marla.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for that presentation, Roger. It threw me back many years. So the points I wanted to make, I don't have slides. The points I wanted to make are related to an article that I released maybe a month ago, and some of the feedback and reactions since. And so I just wanted to highlight a few things around that, where I identified that Trinidad and Tobago loses on average about $2 billion via the errors and omissions item in the balance of payments account. Since 2011, we've lost over $25 billion on a per capita basis. We have the highest per capita loss in the world. And relative to GDP, we have the fourth highest in the world. And in absolute terms, in terms of the dollar amount, that 25 billion that we've lost since 2011, we're number 20 or 21 in the world in terms of how much we've lost. So that means that we are truly exceptional in the fact that we have a problem. Now, the thing about the errors and omissions item, as it says, it's the item that captures errors. And of course, anytime you start to measure anything, you start to make errors. And I mentioned that in my article, that some of what's in this errors and omissions item will be statistical error. But there is also, there are other explanations for the errors and omissions item. Now, none of the reactions or explanations I've gotten address the fact that this problem, this errors and omissions item, suddenly became large and negative in 2011 and remained large and negative since then, except for the two COVID years, 2020 and 21. So it suggests that if you use the argument that it's all statistical error, well, did we suddenly have a collapse in our statistical infrastructure in 2011 and one that persisted since then? Perhaps, but then why has it? And why hasn't that been addressed? Also, ours is, I mean, most countries, the IMF says their errors and omissions item, it's acceptable at about 2 to 3% of GDP. Ours is 2 to 3 times what is the acceptable level. Yet still, based on everything I've said, yet still we don't have a meaningful policy response to this problem. We don't see the authorities articulating, first of all, articulating the fact that we have a problem, but also articulating what is the roadmap towards resolving the problem. So I would think any reasonable government that is aware of the fact that $2 billion is unaccounted for leaving our country every year, they would salivate at this and at solving this problem and identifying where this is coming from and fixing it. Because of course, this is a huge amount. Right now, the government is trying to borrow $100 million for Petrotrin. We wouldn't have to borrow these kinds of sums, presumably, if we didn't have these kinds of leakages. So one would imagine that any reasonable government would want to solve this problem, yet still successive governments in this country have not seen it fit to try and solve it. Now, the ideas or the suggestions that the misclassifications and mismeasurements are what account for this problem, to me, does not necessarily hold a lot of water when in fact, okay, so manufacturers don't respond to these surveys, or at customs, we have different classifications than we do at the central bank for various categories of imports and exports. At the end of the day, whether it's misclassified, whether an item should be in the capital account, but it is in fact in the current account, etc. At the end of the day, as far as I'm aware, from what I know of the banking sector and also from the central bank, the data from the banking sector is complete. Even if from the manufacturing sector or other sectors in the economy, even if their data is incomplete, the data from the banking sector is complete. So all foreign exchange coming into our country or leaving officially goes through the banking sector, is recorded by the banks in the credit card transactions, in the wire transfer transactions, and these amounts are reported to the central bank. So even if other sectors' data is incomplete, the banking sector has the complete data. And so that statistical error that we claim is the problem, which only suddenly became a huge problem in 2011 somehow, is only part of the problem, because we also have another data set that has all of the data on the official flows coming in and leaving of foreign exchange through our banking sector. It means there's something happening that is not recorded by the banking sector. What else did I make a note to say? Yeah, I think that's about it. I think that, you do definitely have statistical problems. You have timing errors, you have misclassification errors, you have all kinds of errors. But if we use the complete data set that we have from the banks, and we still cannot explain $2 billion that should be in our reserves roughly every year, yet it's not there, so we have to stick it in the errors and omissions item, then this is a massive problem. And like I said, on a global scale, it is the largest problem per capita. Ours is, Roger, you put up a chart there that we're one of the 10 worst performing countries, according to our growth numbers, one of the 10 worst performing countries on earth. Well, we are the worst performing country as it relates to the errors and omissions item on a per capita basis, the fourth worst on a GDP basis, and the 20th or 21st worst as it relates to the total dollar amount since 2011. And I haven't heard anybody say anything that sort of refutes the fact that we have the data from the banks, and this is complete data. The banks do, or at least from a regulatory and legal standpoint, they are supposed to report all of this data to the central bank. And if that complete data set is not telling us where this gap is, this $2 billion over $2 billion on average per year, then we have serious problems, and it is incumbent on the authorities to try to address this. I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
This mute button giving me a run for money. Terrence, you're next. I'm not hearing you. I think you're muted. Terrence, you're muted.
I think I'm now unmuted.
Yes, unmuted
All
now.
All right, no, Rebecca is in charge of who speaks and who doesn't. All right, so let me begin. Let me begin by saying that many years ago, people like Carrie Levitt and Eric Sincere and so on used to tell us that to be a good economist, or to be an economist, so not even a good one, that it would be very helpful, in fact, if not necessary, that you spend some time working with the data, understanding the data and understanding where the data comes from, how it is constructed. And they definitely encourage a lot of young economists to go into places like the CSO and the central bank, which of course were the two agencies where that kind of work tended to happen. And I mean, after my many years of experience dealing with these things, I think that advice is in fact very, very good advice for any young economist, that if you want to really understand the concepts that you're dealing with and how these things are measured, the things that roll off our tongues, GDP and foreign exchange and the money supply and so on and so forth, get into a place where these things are measured, and so you can understand the concepts that you are using, and you can understand the limitations of the data that you see. So next slide, please, Rebecca. Thanks. So let me say what Marla just kind of encapsulated what she said. But Marla said some things which I think actually, quite frankly, they shocked me. And I think they shocked a lot of the people who reached out to me and asked me, well, is this true? Is this correct? And so on. And I've quoted her here. And so I wanted to be very clear that I'm quoting her correctly. And she says that we have to stop and think about this. For the past 12 years, over $25 billion has gone missing. On average, over $2 billion each year just disappears. And nobody has been able to account for it ever. So money missing, money disappearing. And I think that is the kind of language that kind of got people kind of wondering what's going on. So certainly the people who are political and so on, their ears picked up because they were saying, well, there's another indication of some kind of malfeasance and so on going on. That she went on in the short piece to talk about the IMF global database on which she got the data on errors and ambitions, mainly due to what she describes as statistical errors. Not quite sure what that means. And then she says that about 77% the size of the economy. In other words, I think what she seems to have done is taken the $25 billion, converted it to TT dollars and divided it by Trinidad and Tobago's current GDP level to get the 77% of the size of our economy. And I'll demonstrate that is actually a wrong way to look at the problem, and equivalent to $16,000 per person and so on. Let's go next slide. Marla also said that the Trinidad and Tobago dollar is overvalued versus the black market FX foreign exchange rate. That's not language, quite frankly, that I think that economists would use in terms of looking at overvaluation. We don't calculate or assess overvaluation or undervaluation in relation to the black market. So I'm not quite sure exactly what that phrase means, but I've highlighted it. And I said that these comments then prompted a lot of steam on social media and so on about people speculating about capital flight and the drug trade and human trafficking and so on and so forth, right? And Marla herself encouraged that kind of speculation in her own speculative comment, talking about money leaving the country via cash and portable valuable goods such as jewelry and so on and so forth, and relating the errors and omissions losses to direct flights to Panama and London and that type of thing. And I thought, and I commented on LinkedIn when Mala posted that thing, to say that I thought that what Mala was saying was not, in fact, correct. It was not that the numbers were wrong, because the numbers have been what they have been. And I have commented on those numbers previously in things that I have done. I have commented on the size of the net errors and omissions. So it is not correct to say that people don't know that there's a problem. And I want to believe that the folks in the central bank do know the size of the problem, and they do know that they have a problem in the central bank. And I'll come a little bit later as to what I haven't spoken to anybody in the central bank about this, quite frankly. But I have a feeling that I think that they are seized of the fact that there is a problem, and I'll try to explain why I think there is a big problem for us in this regard. Next slide. So I just run a couple of conceptual things here for people who may not understand what is the balance of payments and how it is constructed. And so these are actually a couple of slides I had done for the Media Institute for Journalists about a year or two ago, where trying to explain what the balance of payments is and what it means and so on. And by the way, the balance of payments methodology has evolved over the course of the last 40 years or so. We are now on BPM 6, balance of payments methodology 6. It has become very complicated now because the IMF, which sort of guides countries in terms of how you do these things and so on, have evolved the methodology to take into account a number of things which, quite frankly, we didn't do before. When I say we, I'll explain what we mean, which we didn't do before. So the methodology is, in fact, very complicated now because it tries to capture all different kinds of financial transactions and so on, including derivative transactions and so on. But basically, and for the non-economists who are on the call, the balance of payments estimates for a given period, which is usually a year, right? It records the transactions between the residents of a country and the non-residents of the rest of the world. And there's a particular definition of what a resident is and a particular definition of what a non-resident is. So these things are all very definitional and very, you have to document who is a resident and who is a not resident. For example, if somebody is a member of the diplomatic corps and they are physically in Trinidad, they are non-resident for purposes of the balance of payments. So if you do a transaction with the ambassador of Spain, you are dealing with a non-resident, and that is considered to be an external transaction, although the ambassador is sitting right here in Port of Spain. Okay, so there are things like that. There are things like, for example, where if you bring in goods to be some processing to be done, and then those goods are then re-exported. We used to do a lot of that, for example, when we had the refinery. So that for the students on the call, for example, you go back and you look at the data going back many years, you see things called imports UPA, under processing agreement, right? And exports UPA. That's when we had the refinery and crude oil came into Trinidad and Tobago, was refined and then re-exported. Now that fundamentally is a service. It is not, you're not producing anything. You're just taking somebody's oil, you're transforming it, and then you're exporting the refined oil, and you carry out a service. So we had imports UPA and you had exports UPA, and you had to take into account all of these things. The BPM 6 also talks about the international investment position, because what it tries to do is that it tries to capture financial, all of the balance of payments is capturing financial flows, by the way, right? So everything that you do, all these transactions have to be reduced to, in some form, to a dollar value, which is usually a US dollar, which becomes the unit of account for these transactions. And that in itself poses a problem, as we'll see when we're measuring these things. Also it tries to capture now these purely financial transactions. So we think about the balance of payments typically in terms of exports and imports, whether of goods or of services, but financial transactions also need to be captured, right? These are debits or credits which may take place. So if, for example, you are a resident of Trinidad and Tobago, and you have, as we explained just now, might be a company, for example, and you have an account overseas in New York, where I happen to be sitting at the moment in a bank in New York, and that account earns interest, well, then that income belongs to you as a resident of Trinidad and Tobago, and that interest income is supposed to be captured in the balance of payments. Okay, so there's all of those things, and so So it's not an easy exercise. And one of the most important things about doing it is trying to understand and to track all of these flows that are taking place, right? The transactions are valued at market or arm's length prices. So that, again, this is a very important thing, because a lot of the transactions that take place in respect of many of the companies that are resident in Trinidad and Tobago, BPTT, for example, is a resident of Trinidad and Tobago. It's a company incorporated in Trinidad and Tobago. But BPTT sells to BP. It sells to its parent company. And the question is, what is the value of that transaction between BPTT and BP? It is not an arm's length transaction. So you have to figure out not the transfer price, but you have to figure out what is the arm's length price that is supposed to be between those two entities, BPTT and BP, if it is selling to itself. And many companies sell to their parent companies, for example, right? So the balance of payments is, I would say, is one of the more complicated set of accounts that we have to construct. It is in some respects, doing the GDP or the national accounts is actually easier than doing the balance of payments. Now, for the balance of payments, remember, we'll be reducing everything to money, everything to not to TT dollars, to US dollars, trying converting everything to US dollars, and you're trying to capture financial transactions as well, right? Let's go on the next slide. Right, so essentially the balance of payments is structured in the following way. That you have what we call the current account. The current account itself is broken up into several sub-accounts. The merchandise account, which is goods, which is physical things, exports and imports typically. We call exports of goods and exports and imports of goods. There's the services account, which includes all kinds of things, tourism, airlines, and there's what is called the primary income account, which is investment income, things like interest payments and dividend payments. So you incur, Trinidad and Tobago has external debt. When that debt is serviced, the interest is paid on that debt. That's an investment. That's an interest outflow. That's a debit. That was primary income debit, which is the interest paid by the government of Trinidad and Tobago on the debt. And then there's what's called secondary income, what we used to call in the old days unrequited transfers. In other words, there are transactions which you capture on the balance of payments, like a remittance, for example, which is not a two-way transaction. It's a one-way transaction. Somebody in New York sends money to somebody in Barbados, or somebody to somebody in Jamaica, or somebody in Trinidad and Tobago. That's a remittance. It's not a two-way thing, right? So we used to call it unrequited transfer. We now call these things are now called remittances. All of those transactions give you the current account balance, which is the most important analytical balance for a country, particularly for small developing countries. So you look at it from a policy point of view. You want to look at the current account balance. Is my current account balance in surplus, or is it in deficit? If my current account balance is in deficit, then I realize that I have to find ways of dealing with that deficit. That's the key policy thing that you're looking at, the current account balance. Then you have the capital account balance, which are transactions in respect of direct investment. It could be foreign direct investment, and it could be portfolio investment. Portfolio investment being the purchase and sale of securities. People are buying securities in Trinidad, which really does not happen, or more likely Trinidadians, residents buying securities in markets outside of Trinidad and Tobago. Then the financial account balance, which is a fairly new thing which came in. I don't want to be definitive about this, may have been in BPM 4, BPM 5, because we didn't have this in the old days. We had current account, capital account, and change in reserves. The financial account balance actually is supposed to capture all of the transactions, the acquisition and disposal of financial assets, and is therefore equivalent to the sum of the current account balance and the capital account balance. Now, the balance of payments always balances to zero. Now, there is one number that we do know all the time, and that's the change in international reserves. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We can skip to the side. This is one I did for the journalists, so we can see that, right? So we have basically the equation is the current account balance plus the capital account balance. This is how we used to do it. is equal to the change in reserves. Or the capital account balance, the current account balance, and the capital account balance minus your change in reserves is equal to 0, because the balance of payments always balances, and therefore it balances to 0. So if I collect data on my current account, I collect data on my capital account, and I know what my change in reserves is, and it doesn't balance to 0, which it usually doesn't do, right? Then I have an error or an omission. I know I have made a mistake somewhere, or I know I have missed out something, and that is what your NEO number is, your net errors and omissions. It's a net number, meaning that you don't really know whether it's an inflow or outflow, but when you sum them all up, you get a number which is negative, it could be positive. If it is negative, it means that there's been a net outflow, but you don't know where it is, right? It's either a mistake that you've made, or you have missed out something. But you've got to put that number in, because the balance of payments has to balance to 0, okay? So when doing these transactions, we know what, there's one thing definitely that we know. Please stop doing that on the chat. There's one thing that we know. Who is Dr. Rajpal? Somebody who is writing on the screen. Rebecca, there's somebody who is doing something on the call which is quite inappropriate. Yeah, I think that person has left. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Farrell, go ahead. Yes, they have left.
Right. Let's go on. So let's go on to the next slide. What gives rise to? Yeah, can we get that thing off the screen? Is it possible? You may need to screen your guests a little more carefully next time. Right. Yeah. So what gives rise to your net errors and omissions? As I said, the one number that you know with certainty is the change in reserves, because that comes straight out of the central bank's balance sheet. You can know that number every day. You know what is on the central bank balance sheet, you can only change. Now, by the way, the reserves number that we now use, so when people talk about the reserves to date, what we are usually talking about, what we are now talking about, is what is on the central bank's balance sheet. Previously, we used to talk about the reserves as being what is on the central bank's balance sheet plus what is on the balance sheet of the commercial banks, okay? And I'll come to that in a second, right? So that's the one number that we know for sure, right? That we know is absolutely accurate because it's from the central bank's balance sheet. Every other number in the balance of payments is something estimated with varying levels of precision, okay? And one source, for example, I've talked about the fact that it's all done in US dollars. And the fact is that you are collecting data to put into these various classes in the balance of payments, these various categories in the balance of payments, and transactions are done at different exchange rates at different points in time. And so therefore, immediately you're going to have an error because of exchange rate variation during the course of the year that you're doing this calculation, right? So let's go to the next slide. So let's try and understand where our net errors and omissions problem arises. The Central Bank Research Department, where I was Director of Research, took over the preparation of the balance of payments from the CSO in the mid-1980s because of delays in the publication of the balance of payments, which of course is very critical for policy. So we need to have timely data, and of course things have got a lot worse with respect of almost all the data, and we can talk about that. When we took it over, I say we, the CSO continued to be responsible for the merchandise trade account, while the central bank did the surveys for the capital account, and we also did the services account. The reason why we were able to do the services account was because the central bank at the time, we had exchange controls. And at the time, all the transactions on the services account were done via the EC1 system. In other words, if you wanted to pay for your child's education, these companies wanted to pay dividends, you had to come to the central bank. You had to tell them what it is you wanted. They would give you a form to fill out. You did the form, you got the form approved, and you took the form to your commercial bank. So the central bank knew every transaction. The commercial bank could not sell you anything unless it had an approval from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. So we knew all the information because we had it first and people had to get it approved. And this is extremely important to understand what it had then and where we are now, okay? Financial flows related to exports and imports from the upstream energy sector do not, and Mala is wrong about this, they do not flow through the local financial system. So to say that the local banking system has all of the information is absolutely, totally wrong. When BP exports its gas, or its oil, not oil, it's now gas, right? BP exports its LNG from Atlantic LNG to wherever it goes to. The Ministry of Energy knows or ought to know, and we assume that the information on production is accurate, fairly accurate, and Tony Paul and others have some doubts about that, but let's assume that the production data and the export data as produced by the Ministry of Energy is in fact accurate. So to get from that to your export earnings, you have to multiply the output by the price. What is the price? Well, the truth of the matter is you don't know what the price is. BPTT is not going to tell you. EOG is not going to tell you. Nobody is going to tell you, right? The only people that they are going to tell what the truth, something close to the truth might be the Board of Inland Revenue, and you know they're going to lie to them anyway, if they could, because that's what companies do. So how do you get to the value of exports for things like your oil and your gas? And the answer is that, well, all right, you do some kind of triangulation. You say, well, I know what the price is in respect of natural gas traded in the United States. I know what the price is in Japan. I know what the price is in Europe. Where is the LNG going? I presume that this is what the price that they are getting. And I use that to make it's an estimate that you are doing to get to your export earnings. That number is not an accurate number. The only people who know what the accurate number is BP and EOG and Shell. They know what the accurate number is. We are estimating what the number is. Now, where is the financial transaction associated with that export of gas? It is not in any of the local banks. It's not in any of the local banks. BP outside does not send money back to the local bank to pay Atlantic LNG. It doesn't happen. So therefore, it is not true to say that the local banking system captures, or even for the import side, when BP is bringing a drilling rig down to Trinidad to drill some field and so on, that is, depending on how long the rig stays in the country, that's another thing in terms of defining whether it's an import or not, and the customs has their own rules about what is an import and what is not. But that transaction, that import, what we would call an import transaction, is not paid for in the local banking system. And so therefore, it is simply not correct to say that these transactions are captured in the local banking system. They are not. And that's a significant chunk of what you're trying to capture in the balance of payments, right? So I said the financial flows related to exports and imports of upstream energy sector do not flow to the local banking system, and they're estimated. The upstream companies remit their taxes to the Ministry of Finance directly to the central bank and not to the local banking system. So when BP is paying its taxes, when Shell is paying its taxes, by an arrangement that was done in the 1970s, orchestrated by people like Frank Rampersad and so on, they pay their money direct. That's how the central bank gets foreign exchange, to be able to sell to the local banking system. It is paid, it comes from the taxes that are paid by the upstream companies directly to the central bank. The central bank then credits the government of Trinidad and Tobago with the TT dollar equivalent, and it keeps the foreign exchange, which it then uses to supply the rest of the non-energy sector. That's how the central bank gets foreign exchange. And that is why the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago's position has been very different from, for example, the Central Bank of Barbados or the Central Bank of Jamaica. They don't have those foreign exchange flows coming into them as the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago does. They are reliant on government borrowing and so on to be able to get their foreign exchange. We get government borrowing. Government borrows, it also comes from the central bank, but we are also getting those critically important, those tax revenues flowing into the central bank, which allows the central bank to maintain that position and service the rest of the non-energy economy. right? And this is why we are saying that the sales and purchases numbers, these are the numbers on sales and purchases of foreign exchange, which the central bank religiously publishes every month. You can go onto their website in the data center, you get those numbers. If it were true that this banking system at the central and the commercial banks, Mara is right, commercial banks do report to the central banks very religiously. They report weekly and monthly and quarterly their data to the central bank, and the data are accurate in terms of what they report. But the data are not complete. The data are accurate, but they are not complete. So purchases, that column that shows purchases of foreign currency from the public, look at the numbers 4.7 billion, 5 billion, and so on. But if all of the export earnings were coming into Trinidad, that number would be 10 billion, 11 billion, 12 billion. So that you understand what we are dealing. So you have to understand the data that you are dealing with and where the data is coming from, what the data are telling you. The sales of foreign exchange to the public is what the commercial banks, that is to say what we call authorized dealers, are selling to the public. And that number doesn't correspond to the imports data either, because as I said, a lot of the import transactions are paid for elsewhere. For example, even a local company, and we'll explain why in a second, even a local company that has foreign exchange earnings will pay for its imports in New York or in London, not through Republic Bank or Scotiabank or Citibank in Trinidad. And so imports, maybe the import transaction, maybe finance, the financial flows associated with those imports do not take place in Trinidad. It's important to understand that, to understand where the data are, what the data are, and what the data are telling you. So if you're using these information that I have here, which you can get from the central bank data center very easily, you have to know what it is telling you, what it represents, in fact, okay? So let's go on to the next slide. So in 1993, we floated the exchange rate, but we didn't only just float the exchange rate, we abolished exchange controls. This is important to understand. And what we also did is that we abolished exchange controls not only on the current account, but also on the capital account. This was unprecedented at the time for a country like Trinidad and Tobago to abolish exchange controls on the capital account as well. What does abolishing exchange control on the capital account mean? It means, in effect, that if a Trinidad and Tobago company wants to invest overseas, it does not need to go to the central bank to get any money. It didn't have to. Long ago you had to, now you don't. If you want to do that in Barbados, if a Barbados company now wants to make an investment outside of Barbados, it must get approval from the Central Bank of Barbados. Trinidad and Tobago companies need no such approval. It's important for us to understand that. That change that we made in 1993 was a profound change in the arrangement. But the abolition of exchange controls therefore meant that the central bank no longer had access to the EC1 data on all of those transactions on the services account in particular, or on the capital account. We had no access to the data on those things because exchange controls had been abolished. Right? Now we also had a technological change. Because those of you who are old enough to remember, when you had to travel long ago, you had to get something called a traveler's check to travel, right? With the advent of credit cards, it meant that people no longer needed to get traveler's checks to travel. The reason why I could count up the traveler's checks and I could therefore estimate the amount of money people were spending on travel. Now people have credit cards which they can use to pay for anything. They can use to pay for goods, and they can use to pay for services. And funds are now also routinely remitted by wire transfer. So having removed exchange controls and with the use of credit cards, the central bank no longer have ready access to data on the services account, which had been generated by the EC1 system. And the central bank is now doing the estimates for the energy exports, not the CSO. All right. So next slide. So what I'm saying is that what these profound changes, institutional and technological, meant is that it's become more difficult for the central bank to estimate the services account as well as some components of the capital and financial accounts. Financial flows could be identified, but the purpose would not be apparent. So let me be very clear. When you do a credit card transaction with your bank can tell the central bank that X amount of money was spent by credit cards, and the central bank actually publishes that information. You can get it, it's there. But they don't know what it's for. They don't know whether you bought a book or whether you bought a holiday in the Mediterranean. They don't know. The commercial bank doesn't know. Or even if the commercial bank knows, they don't tell. So the commercial bank does not know, and therefore the central bank does not know, and therefore it can't classify that $100 into a good or a service. It simply doesn't know. And it's important for us to understand that. So there are certain things, for example, if I use a credit card and I bring in a physical item, I bring in a part for my car, or I bring in a book, right? People on this call like to bring in books, right? The physical thing actually crosses the customs barrier. And so therefore, customs picks that up. But if you buy a holiday, or if you are paying for some kind of whatever, or you're using a credit card to fund your account overseas and so on, how would they know what it's for? They won't. So there are financial flows that can be identified, for example, credit card transaction, but the purpose, the classification, it's a question of misclassification. It's a question of non-classification. The thing is not classified. It's not that it's put in the wrong place. It's not as if they put it in the capital account and they put it in the current account. No, you not put anywhere because you don't know where to put it. Now, then there are other transactions that we know that the financial flow must take place, but it can't be identified. So there are things like that. Right? So let's go on to the next slide, because I know people are reading faster. And this is the last slide. This is Marla's point about 77% of GDP and so on. That's not the way in which you do it. I said the numbers that Marla's produced on the net resolutions are correct. But the question is, how significant is this? And I'm not sure where she gets this thing about the IMF say 2 to 3% of GDP is a good number. I don't know why people continue to quote the IMF, about these numbers and these so-called international benchmarks, there are no such things. I have never heard what these things are. Like 3 months import cover is some kind of international benchmark. I don't know who invented that number. I don't know where that number comes from as a measure of reserve adequacy. And so the IMF is saying that 2 to 3% of GDP is an adequate number for that. I don't know where they invent that number from, because it can't be an international benchmark unless it's truly international, and it is not. But anyway, what I'm saying here is that what I've done with Marla's DO numbers, I've converted it to TT dollars, taken GDP in the different years and looked at those numbers as a percent of GDP, and on average, it's about 7% of GDP. It's not a 77% of GDP, which got everybody totally panicked and so on, but it's a big number, right? So let's go on to the next slide. It's a big number, but it is what it is. So I'm saying that the net errors and omissions, it's a problem. We have a problem, and I warrant you. I don't know the people in the central bank. I haven't spoken to them, but I know that they have a problem, right? And I don't know what they're doing about it or how they intend to perhaps deal with it. But it's a problem that many countries have. And if you look at, I know Marla has done research on this, and other people have done research on it, and the IMF is doing research on it, and so on the problem, right? And we do have to do better. But as the central bank put out in their media release, consequent on Marla raising this red flag, is that they said the response rate to the surveys is 50%, which is ridiculous. So the firms in Trinidad and Tobago have to cooperate with the central bank and the CSO in generating good and timely data. Everybody's complaining about the data, and they're complaining about all kinds of things and so on. I don't understand how it is that the government is making good policy here where we don't even have good data. Roger thinks that 100,000 Venezuelans came to Trinidad. The CSO is telling us that the population of Trinidad and Tobago is 1.3 billion. The IMF and the World Bank is saying the population is 1.5 billion. Who is correct? We don't know. And the population number is a critically important number. GDP from the expenditure side, we have not calculated that for I don't know for how long. After you ask somebody, well, what is the investment rate in this economy? And nobody knows. I don't know if the CSO knows, but certainly I have never seen any publication of the national income account that tell me what the investment rate is, and we're talking about the growth in the economy, we have a huge data problem. The CSO has collapsed on itself, and this goes back, as I've said, back to the 1980s. So our net errors and emissions high? The answer is yes, they are very high. And as I said, I've commented on this before. But I am saying that the problem is more likely to lie in the problems is in the current account. And it is very likely to lie on the services side, where we are not capturing the data. We get in the financial flows, but we're not classifying them. They're just not being classified. And so therefore they drop down into net errors and emission. And so that is not a case that the money missing or the money disappear. We've spent it. All that money that you're talking about there, that we think missing somewhere. I don't know where people think the money gone. The money is gone. Yes, it is true, the money is gone, but it's because we have spent it already. And that goes back to the point that Roger was making earlier about how we have been consuming our foreign exchange. Are the net errors and emissions too high? The answer is yeah, they're probably too high. And so on, but we need to get the number down to something, which means that we need to have a better system of classification. Is there capital flight? There probably is, yes, but I just want to point out again that one of the things that happened in 1993 with the abolition of exchange controls is that we also gave up the surrender requirement. The surrender requirement was that if you got foreign exchange, you had to surrender it to the central bank. That is no longer the law. And the law now is that anybody can have an account anywhere in the world that they want to. You can have a bank account anywhere in the world. You can also have a foreign currency account, usually a US dollar account, in the local banks in Trinidad. And the local banks in Trinidad have foreign currency deposits of $4 billion sitting there that belong to residents of Trinidad and Tobago. So there is an unknown amount of money sitting outside in the world, in New York, in London. I don't know if people keep their money in Sydney, in Australia, I don't know, where people bank their money, that belong to Trinidadians who operate their bank accounts and their deposit accounts. And when they go away and travel, they use that money to do whatever it is they want to do. And we don't know how big that number is. I just don't know. But we know that there's $4 billion in the local banking system, that is with Republic and Scotia and Citi and all these other banks and so on, $4 billion that is sitting in our local banking system. Actually, not physically in Trinidad, of course, they're in New York and London, but they are recorded and they are there. So when we say capital flight, Trinidadians don't need to fly their capital anywhere. Since 1993, we have had legal authority to move capital to wherever it is we want to put it, right? And then the final point is the drug trade a factor. I say, well, maybe it is a factor. I don't know, but we will have to assume that if we think that the drug trade is somehow responsible for net errors and emissions, that the fellows who are doing this drug business and so on are somehow part of the official system. They're doing banking transactions and so on. Because the point about a NEO is that the thing gets recorded somewhere. It is recorded, but it is not classified. It's recorded, but it's not classified. So if you tell me that the drug runners or drug players are doing these things, then it must mean that they must be doing banking, but their transactions are not being classified, so therefore it's falling into net errors and emissions. So that's why I want to end by saying that yeah, we have a problem with the net errors and emissions, but I think that Marla got it wrong in terms of her analysis and the conclusions that she drew on the problem. So thank you.
Dr. Conrad, unmute your mic.
There we go. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Professor Hussein, Dr. Farrell, and Marla Dukaran for your lively discussions. In the beginning, I forgot to mention that my name is Darren Conrad, and I'm actually the head of the Department of Economics. So busy introducing everyone. Thank you for the lively discussion. And no doubt the chat is, conversations are going on in the chat. I note that Roger has been answering one or two questions that would be addressed to him. So in the interest of time, I would we would read those comments, not all of them. And I would really appreciate it if we can stay respectful in the chat as well. So, Roger, I think the first question you already answered. Are illegal immigrants helping the economy? I saw you posted the response to that. Thank you so much. And the comment for that was bringing the underground economy to at least estimate it into the national accounting system. I'll edit out that portion.
Darren, if I could just extend the comment on that just a little.
Okay.
I won't stay long.
Okay.
So
sure.
I noted that Terence referred to the 100,000 figure, and I got that from several commentators online. I don't know if it's true or not. In fact, they referred to 120,000. I generally say if it's 120,000, let's take out 40,000 and treat it as 80,000. Now I have a sense from renting to the Venezuelans and from a book that I wrote via stakeholder consultation. I have a sense of the numbers that just from scaled up information, but by no means a census, by no means comprehensive information. And that's why we keep pleading for the Ministry of Labor. Okay, so these people are here, we are trying to help them and do some humanitarian interventions and whatnot. At a minimum, make it necessary for them to register with the Ministry of Labor. So we have an idea of the size of the demographic dividend. Remember, this is the only factor of production that is booming in Trinidad and Tobago. And if you get an idea of the size of the demographic dividend, you could do some magic with that. Now, if it is, we go to New York and we are unregistered, what do? We go in a hotel and we work in the back room somewhere. We hope nobody sees us and we contribute to the informal non-tradable sector. Now, I see that the Minister of Finance refers to economic growth taking place. And I did a decomposition of the economy into 3 substantive categories: non-booming tradable, non-tradable, and I decomposed it into tradable and then into non-booming tradable and energy goods and also into the non-tradable sector. So 3 categories. And when I looked closely at the data, the growth is coming mainly from the non-tradable sector. So when you say we have, in fact, for 2023, let me make it clear that the data is pointing towards no growth so far. So in fact, if you take the 2023 data that the IMF posts at 2.5, and you use instead the CSO data, and you calculate average growth for the 3 quarters that's available online, you would see 0 growth. In other words, we remain in the top 10 worst performing economies in the world in terms of economic growth performance. And it worries me, Darren. It worries me because it points to a deep underlying structural problem. And unless we take 20 steps back and we look at this deep underlying structural problem and the continued, in my opinion, misuse of the Venezuelan labor in the terms of not having an appropriate allocation that is kind to our foreign exchange, the pace of decline is going to continue, and we are not going to go from E towards F. We are going to go somewhere from E, somewhere northwards, and that stock of foreign exchange is going to disappear even faster. So it's something that we have to keep in mind, and I think running down growth, all growth is not good. The growth in Trinidad and Tobago now, in particular, has to be non-energy export oriented. Unless we do that, when we get 200 US at the counter, now we are fussing. In a year and a half time, it could be 50 US, unless we radically change the mode in which we look at the Trinidad and Tobago economy. Thank you.
Thank you for that response, Roger. The next comment is by Kailash Basdeo, said that there's no room for any emerging markets for manufacturing industry in Trinidad because the large conglomerates are free to do as they want. What can be grown locally here and not utilizing our manufacturing capacity for export from Trinidad. No regulations, supervision on these companies. Marla, send the next question your way. In your delivery, you mentioned that something has to be done. And one of the questions from Kristen Batten is, what is that something?
just the last one for me, Darren, or the one before?
Yeah, just
about just
the last one. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
but you can feel free to
So
comment on Roger as well.
no, thanks. I
Okay.
think there's lots of research about different countries that have had problems. Notably, Nigeria have spent the better part of the past, more than 10 years reading about this, thinking about this. Is almost an obsession. And there are lots of countries that have had large errors and omissions items, and they have improved their statistical infrastructure and been able to address their problems. I mean, I can't go into the technicalities of all of them now, but there are solutions. And it's largely in improving statistics, because even if there are transactions that are deliberately opaque, you would be able to identify in the data to what extent those exist.
Thank you, Mona. Let me see if I can find a question that would be directed at Terrence. Well, I'm not seeing any directly related to what you present. Oh, yes. How many of us have local, far less foreign bank accounts? That is related to 1% and large companies. Should we review our regulations on holding US abroad? I think, Terrence, you can want to comment on that.
Well, I think the word hoarding is a subjective word. I mean, people are not necessarily hoarding. Like when in 1993 we made a decision, a policy decision in this country, which was profound, and so therefore people, and you're right, it's probably the top 1% of the society who are in a position, and I would include a lot of the people who are on this call as well, actually, who are in a position to be able to have foreign currency accounts. Because I think simultaneous with all of these things, there were all of these KYC requirements and so on. So it's not easy to establish an account overseas or to do securities trading overseas as an individual and so on. It's not easy, but some people are able to do it, and a lot of people have in fact been doing it. And so therefore, it is, I think it is the case that a lot of Trinidadians, which could be 1%, certainly not 99%, these people don't have to queue up in the bank to buy $50 or $200 or $1,000 to go on a holiday. And they travel, they have their credit cards, and they use their credit cards because they have the wherewithal to do that. Whereas other people who will in fact struggle, because if they want to get money to educational purposes, to send their children to school and so on, they first have to find the TT dollars, and then you have to be able to find the foreign exchange to do that. One other comment about cash, and I see Richard Young is on the thing as a former banker, and he knows these things much far better than I do. That there's not a lot of US dollar or foreign cash circulating in Trinidad. It's not, because it is very expensive for the banks to be able to deal with that. First of all, cash, generally speaking, globally is declining in use, right? You go to these metropolitan countries now and nobody is using cash. And we are now talking about moving to a cashless society. So therefore, the idea of people bringing cash back into Trinidad is not what it used to be. We don't bring cash back and sell it to the commercial banks. And for the commercial banks, it's a big hassle to have foreign cash in their vaults. And so they have to find ways of getting that to the central bank and remitting that back to the bank in New York, which handles that type of thing and so on. In fact, I recently saw an article about the problem that Jamaicans were having in that regard. So there's not a lot of foreign cash circulating in Trinidad. So when people go to the bank and they say, I want to get $200 US in cash, banks will tell you, I just don't have it, because they don't have cash. That is notes. They don't have those notes, definitely no coins. They have no notes that they can in fact sell to you.
Thank you very much, Terrence, for that response. I'll come back to another banking question. If you want to ask a question in person, you can unmute your mic and proceed to ask, but indicate raising your hand in the chat. Okay, I recognize Dr. Gonzalez.
Yes, good evening. I think Mara raised a fundamental question about the size of these net errors and omissions, and the fact that relative to other countries, we are very high on the list. I think this is a cause of concern, especially over the length of time. And I think we all agree from listening to all these speakers, we all admit that we have a problem. Now, the problem may be in the complexities of calculating the balance of payments, or it may be in other things and we don't know. What seems to be of interest to me here is what work, what investigations have we done, what research have we done to try to understand where this problem is coming from? Because it seems very strange to me that something like this could go on for such a long period of time and we don't have the investigations to try to see where the discrepancies are coming from. That is what is a bit worrying to me here. I haven't heard any speaker say, yes, the central bank or the CSO investigated this particular area and they found that such and such was the case. So that I think we are dealing with something. And when I read the IMF paper there, when they talk about 2% of GDP being the average and we are 7% of GDP, then I think that has to be a cause of concern. Now, none of us have the answers here, or we know the problems of calculating the balance of payments and so forth. But what we need to do is to get the research going, get the investigation going to try to understand why it is so large. Because we are not the only country here with this kind of economy, with foreign companies and with people doing the kind of trading that they're doing and so on. We are not unique in that sense. But the fact that we are so high on the list, I think, is very worrisome. And I think that is one of the fundamentals that I would like to see taking place. Thanks.
I think you all are all speaking to the bane of our research in terms of getting good quality data. And it's very challenging to get data out of anyone. And I think I saw Richard Young mention that people are not willing to share data. This one is for Dr. Farrell. How does the central bank ensure the accuracy of balance of payments data, especially when some financial flows don't go through the local banking system? From Brian Smith.
Well, accuracy is relative. So as I said, the central bank, every item on the balance of payments, except for the change in reserves, is an estimated number. Right. So I try to explain how the export earnings one is calculated. Imports are generated by the customs mainly. So the customs collects the data on import transactions, gives that to the CSO gives it to the central bank. The data on capital transactions are captured by the survey. So what the survey does is it identifies what are called foreign direct investment enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago. That is the companies like the BPs and the Shells and so on, the foreign-owned companies. And it asks those companies periodically to tell us, give you all their transactions, not all their transactions, but the transactions relevant to compiling the balance of payments. And then that is used to populate the data on the current account. The gap that we have is on the services account of the current account. The services account of the current account. That's the gap that we have. And I try to explain why that gap has arisen and why it has grown, because as the economy grows, those transactions have grown. And so therefore the size, it is not true to say, by the way, that there were no errors and omissions before. If you go back to the early data on the balance of payments, there always were net errors and omissions. They were always there. But the reason why the number was relatively smaller then, I tried to explain, was up until the time that we had exchange controls in 1993, we had the data because the central bank had it. Post 1993, the central bank didn't have it and had difficulty getting it and continues to have difficulty getting it. And I know Anthony Gonzalez talking about discrepancies. When we use language like that of discrepancy and so on, you're trying to suggest that there's something amiss or wrong or something like that and so on. All I'm saying is that what we capture the financial flows, that's how we have a number for the net errors and omissions in the first place. You capture those numbers, but you can't classify them. You don't know where they belong. And I am positing that where most of them belong is in the current account of the balance of payments, and most of them belong in the services part of the current account of the balance of payments. And we have spent the money already. It only money ain't gone in somebody's pocket somewhere or lose somewhere or drop in a hole somewhere. The money has already been spent by us, Trinidadians. So it's not missing, it's not disappeared. We spent it. And the reason why we spent it is because all of the things that Rogers talked about at the start, I mean, his diagrams, ribs and cistern and so on. But basically, when you have an overvalued exchange rate, it is cheaper to do these things. And we have an overvalued exchange rate. And the government has continued to maintain this policy in respect of the external accounts. We have our foreign exchange reserves have run down from December of 2014, 11.5 billion at the high point, now down to 6-point-something billion. And most of that 6-point-something billion is in fact borrowed reserves. Our non-borrowed reserves, I don't know what the calculation is, but it must be less than $1 billion of non-borrowed reserves. We have run down our foreign exchange reserves almost deliberately. We have run it down, and we have been borrowing, so the external debt has been increasing. And to Roger's point, I know Roger likes his particular way of looking at it. The fundamental problem is that we have this economic model that we are running, which I call quite frankly a rentier, rent-seeking society, which is generating the outcomes that we are getting, including the declining labor participation rate that Roger is talking about.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, go ahead. This
My
is
question-
Jimmy Chankit.
Yes. My question is to Terry. Terry, one of the issues we have heard a lot in recent times is about the underground economy. And references are made about holdings and exchanges of currencies which evolve from the drug trade. How do we capture or understand or estimate what that number is? Because I hear numbers being bandied about, but how does the central bank capture that information or estimate what it is?
Well, Jimmy, it is difficult and near impossible to do it, and that's why it's called an underground economy, because it's hard to do. Now, so let me just give you an example of some of the kinds of quite frankly, kind of nonsense that we talk sometimes, right? When we demonetize the $100 note, right? We came up with a discrepancy, and to use Peter Gonzalez's word discrepancy, there's a real discrepancy, right? Because the central bank knows exactly how much $100 notes it had issued, and it knows how much it got back. And the difference was about $430-something million. Our politicians have been jumping up and down saying that $430-something million has to do with all the underground economy and drug trade and all kinds of things, which is really cannot be true. Most of that $430-something million is in people's pockets and wardrobe drawers and things all over the place. And everybody on this call knows somebody who ended up with several thousand Trinidad and Tobago dollars after the demonetization closed and couldn't get it back changed. It had nothing to do with crime, had nothing to do with any underground economy. People had money in the drawer and the closet that they forget about. You know, a number of people came to me. People had money in safety deposit boxes in commercial banks, sitting down, thousands of dollars after the demonetization window had closed, and then say, well, can you call the central bank governor and see what he could do about this? And of course, there's nothing that could be done. It wasn't about crime and drugs. The criminals who knew about the demonetization exercise went and changed the money immediately. And so therefore the idea that it was this 400 was in my view, was totally flawed. But the underground economy does exist, and criminals tend to use cash because it is not traceable. And so therefore, to the extent that you see cash being sustained in any economy, you can kind of figure out, well, some of that has to do with the underground economy. But Jimmy, the answer is that it is extremely difficult to figure out what that is. And by the way, we have to make a distinction between the informal economy That is to say, people are conducting very legitimate transactions, but they are not part of the formal economy. And so therefore they are not paying taxes, they are not filing any returns anywhere, but they are making a living. And there are a lot of people in Trinidad who function, Trinidad and Tobago, who function like that, who are part of the informal economy, but they are not engaged in criminal activity.
Okay, thank you, Terence.
Thank you.
This is from Stephen Cummings. You can unmute if you want to ask a question, but this is for Marla. Marla, I would like for you to respond to Dr. Terence on you getting it wrong from Stephen Cummings, senior broadcast journalist.
I'm happy to be wrong. It's not fun to know that my country is one of the worst performing in this area.
We're not hearing Marla.
Sorry, you all not hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Yep,
Yeah.
I'm hearing you.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. So let me respond to a few things. With respect to the IMF, now, if we agree we're going to be using IMF methodology on how to calculate the balance of payments, I'm not sure why it's not valid to then also use the IMF standard, where they say their benchmark is around 2 to 3% of GDP as an acceptable level for an errors and omissions item. Also, when we talk about the fact that we no longer have foreign exchange controls. Yes, we abolished formal foreign exchange controls, but we know that we've had de facto controls for over 10 years. And whilst the transactions are not recorded the way they were, or reported to the central bank, I should say, the way they were when we had formal controls, these de facto controls mean that the banks have to collect more data. For example, invoices for foreign currency transactions being asked, the client being asked to submit these invoices and so on to justify their request for foreign exchange. With respect to the issue of, yes, the oil and gas companies don't in fact send the tax revenue to the banking sector in Trinidad and Tobago. The thing is, we've been exporting petroleum for over 100 years. So they've had this relationship or dynamic with respect to the Board of Inland Revenue and the government of Trinidad and Tobago, presumably for several years, many, many decades. So it still doesn't really answer my question as to why is it that the errors and omissions items suddenly became large and consistently negative since 2011. Again, because we've been exporting oil and gas for, well, petroleum in any event, for over 100 years. With respect to the oil and gas companies not sending their data on their exports, actually they submit their data under the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Transparency Initiative, the TTEITI, and I would imagine if the central bank asks the oil and gas producers to submit their data, they would. And if not, we can always legislate for them to do so that it can help us explain some of the errors and omissions item. I would imagine if that could be part of the solution. Dr. Farrell mentioned that he's not sure what the level of non-borrowed reserves. Actually, right now, non-borrowed reserves and those also not withdrawn from the HSF. So in other words, if we hadn't borrowed, our government hadn't borrowed, and if we hadn't withdrawn from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, right now our reserves would be around $100 million US, which is about a week or two of import cover. That's according to the latest data I have available to me. Now, with respect to the question of, well, could the errors and omissions item be partially explained by illegal activity, in particular drugs and weapons trafficking and so on, and the suggestion that that's probably not part of it? I actually think that if you look at the fact that the FIU is on a daily basis being sent or almost on a daily basis, they get suspicious transaction reports from the banks. It would suggest that there is some level of activity that reaches the banks that are suspicious. May not necessarily be specifically related to money laundering in every case, but there are laws on the onus on the banks, the responsibility of the banks to submit suspicious transactions reports to the FIU when they arise. Those are my responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marla. Panelists, would you mind if we took one or two more comments or questions?
No problem.
I mean,
Okay.
I hope, yeah, because people are come on and give them a chance to speak. How often you get to speak to Terence and Marla? So,
and we won't get, and please, just a reminder to keep the chat clean. I'm seeing some comments that are a little bit disturbing. So I'll skip past those. There was a question in the chat here that was directed to, well, I'll send this one to Marla. Well, I think you partially answered the question, what we were doing before 2011 and what changed. And I think in Terence's presentation, he alluded to some of what changed. But you want to say anything on that? Anything on that?
Sorry, what was the question?
For Marla, they were sending
Marla.
this one to Marla. Yeah.
Sorry, what's your
changed?
question?
The question really amounts to what changed, what happened in 2012 that changed so drastically, and the errors and omissions went so significantly high.
Well, I saw that Angela Henry put in the chat that there was an adoption of, let me make sure I get it right, version 6
BPM
method.
6.
Right. I guess we have the answer.
Okay.
If you looked at the BPM 6 methodology, it is very complicated, you know. And trying to pick up financial transactions and so on is not easy, and I suspect that could explain it. But I think if you really roll back the data, go back pre-2011, the errors and omissions have always been there, and they will always be there. You know, the size is important, and I am agreeing with Marla. Let me just say the point at which I agree with Marla. The numbers are there, and the numbers are real. And the numbers are too high. I've said that, right? I don't believe in anything about any international IMF benchmarks. I don't. An international benchmark has to be international, and it can't be international at the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe, not anything. When they say international, they really mean all these set of developing countries. That's what they mean. The United States has no benchmark for import cover. The United Kingdom has no benchmark for import cover. That is something that the IMF pushes on people with a lot of foolishness. And you can't put a standard like that for all countries. Different countries operate differently. And the same would apply to the NEO. So I'm saying that, yes, it is too high. I think, as I've said, I think the central bank guys know that it is too high. And they are trying to figure out, well, how we could possibly, deal with this. And, let me just deal with Marla's point about suspicious transaction reports. There's actually a case going to the courts now dealing with these suspicious transaction reports. And I think in that case, the judge also clearly doesn't understand things about suspicious transaction reports and the Financial Intelligence Unit. The banks, this is from money laundering. All the banks, and Richard Young is on the call, so he'll back me up on this. All the banks have implemented a computerized, automated system with a set of algorithms to try to identify what are called suspicious transactions. That's how it's done, right? People don't go through it physically, look and see, whether Darren Conrad is a good guy or not. No. There's a computer program that looks at transactions, how money is placed, money being placed in different bank branches, etc., and those are flagged as suspicious transactions. So when the newspaper journalists report that the banks report billions of dollars in suspicious transactions, that is simply all that they are. They are just suspicious transactions but it doesn't mean that they amount to anything. They're sent to the FIU. The FIU then looks at them and then decides whether or not anything is worth pursuing. And how many have we heard from the FIU have been worth pursuing? And the answer is, quite frankly, I haven't heard of any, right? There's a current case going on now where, in fact, the matter didn't come from a suspicious transaction report. And the judge is saying that you can't go and ask the bank for information unless it comes from a suspicious transaction report. But that's another matter, right? But people misinterpret, again, the SPRs and the SARs in terms of what it actually is telling us, right? The BIR is a big problem. The Board of Inland Revenue shares data with nobody, not even the Auditor General can walk into the Board of Inland Revenue. And part of the confusion that we've had with the Minister of Finance and the Auditor General has to do with the fact that the Board of Inland Revenue doesn't want to share information about what it is doing. And that information that the Board of Inland Revenue collects, by the way, is critically important for a number of things, including, for example, the estimation of income inequality and wealth inequality in society. And the BIR is not giving it to anybody. It can easily anonymize data so that they don't have my name and Darren's name and everybody's name and so on. But the data is made available to people to be analyzed for doing that kind of work. But the BIR has a totally closed mind about its data, and that needs to be fixed. And one of the things that perhaps the Constitution Amendment might do is to force the Board of Inland Revenue to be able to do that kind of thing. Mala's point about de facto controls, that is really not correct. The commercial banks will ask you for things like invoices simply to validate that it's a bona fide transaction. They're not using it for the purposes of classifying anything. And so therefore, it really doesn't help the problem that the central bank has in respect of these transactions. So yes, there is a de facto control because the Ministry of Finance has been dictating to the central bank or been dictating to the commercial banks that they restrict people's access to foreign exchange. So yes, there are de facto informal controls, which unfortunately is inequitable because it affects poor people, people without access, people who don't know anybody more than the other people. And that's the problem. It's inequitable.
I have a comment to make, if I may.
Let me take a question from Stephen Cummings. His hand has been up for a little bit there.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen Cummings here. I want to pose this question to either Dr. Farrell or Dr. Hussain. We have talked about these large companies, being, huge users of foreign exchange. I'm wondering if there's any way that we can track, the usage of these companies. Is there any way that that can be captured in the data? I heard one comment where some commentators said that when the Petrochem oil refinery was up and running, it was a major, earner of foreign exchange. And now that we have a different arrangement with the restructuring, we now have more of a user of foreign exchange. So I just wanted to get some ideas to how that can be managed. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Darren, you'd like me to go first?
Yes, you can go ahead, Roger.
Okay, thanks. This question and comment as relates to big companies and big groups getting a lot of foreign exchange comes up all the time. And I could understand that the average person, when they don't get foreign exchange, they are concerned, especially because it comes across sort of like an equity issue. But when these big companies get foreign exchange and they can purchase in bulk and make solid, substantive import demands that could bring in goods and services at lower price than a small entity, that actually works from a welfare perspective for the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, what we are seeing and what we need to see more of is that these big users of foreign exchange also develop the capacity, either via transshipment, to generate some of the foreign exchange that they use. And as the crunch becomes tighter I mean, quite a number of companies, for example, come to me and I direct them as best as I could to set up shop in the OECS or in places like Curaçao or Aruba, where foreign exchange is so abundantly and easily available, and try to manage their imports into the Caribbean in a manner and form that what they relocate from imports into Trinidad and Tobago and generate foreign exchange for within the Caribbean can help to pay overall for their imports into Trinidad and Tobago. So we have no choice now but to be creative. We have no choice now but to encourage firms more in the direction of importing those that import, but in a manner and form that allow them to use these imports in other parts of the Caribbean to generate some of the foreign exchange that they want. Now, a lot of people will turn towards Manatee and say, well, in the media, and I see Minister Young and several other people making this error, in my opinion. They say, basically, production of natural gas would move from about 2,200 mmcf per day or 2,300 mmcf per day to, let's say, about 2,800 mmcf per day or 2,900. When you look at the growth performance associated with that level of natural gas production, you would see it's very weak. And therefore, whilst it would help, I'm not saying it's not going to help the foreign exchange position, I'm saying that's just a marginal change. Now, if we could get other things like Jagan and other fields coming on stream that could bring us close to 4,000, yes, we will be back to the good times. I am not personally, Dr. Conrad, seeing that occurring in the medium term. So therefore, the request is that the Ministry of Trade in particular take a double down on trying to push the economy from points such as E to points such as F, where, for example, we sign all these partial scope trade agreements with Chile, with Curaçao, I think we have one with Guatemala, and very, very underutilized. In my opinion, insubstantive technical analysis goes into determining natural trading partner and trade complementarity and which trading partner we have a best fit with our exports and their imports. That has to be a thing of the past, and we have to manage where we could get potential foreign exchange from in a more scientific manner. Then there is this whole aspect of tourism. In places like Aruba, they are trying to cut the amount of tourists that come to Aruba from 2 million, probably to around 1.4, 1.5 million, because it's too much. Whereas in Trinidad and Tobago, we are struggling to even get back to our 2019 numbers. And I think it's such a low-hanging fruit that it has me shocked and baffled that we are not going that direction. And the same argument could be made for diaspora remittances. But none of these things would really happen, Dr. Conrad, if you continue to have an enabling environment or lack of an enabling environment in which your homicide rate per capita in 2022 was the highest in recorded history from 1956 to 2024. I don't know if other people have data before 1956, but I look at this data all the time, it was the highest. In 2023, it was the second highest ever. And if you look at the data up until the point in time today, which is 428, and you scale it up for the year, you will get 643. Then you would realize that we are en route to the highest ever in 2024. Now, that's totally unacceptable. And in that type of setting, it is an endogenous problem. We can make modifications to the state of emergency, limited curfew, gun amnesty. There are things we can do, in my opinion, as a lay person, that could drastically bring down the murder level and give citizens a chance to breathe. And probably when you breathe some more oxygen and you get more clarity, you may do more export-oriented investment. But it's just not there right now. The enabling environment is not there. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago, instead of, yes, they are doing a number of other things, but I think if we could change that crime situation and lift the labor force participation rate from 54.6% closer to the average in Bermuda, which is 79, or in the Bahamas, which is 73, that alone could help make a significant amount of factors of production unleashed for a wide range of productive activities. So some of the problems are endogenous, some are within our capacity to fix, and to me, it's just laxity is not being done. I'm sorry, that's my honest opinion.
Yes. May I comment now?
Yes, and then after we would take Ashford. His hand has been up for a while. Ashford, Mirage.
Okay, I am focusing on the lament that Dr. Farrell made a while ago in relation to a statistics, the National Statistics Institute. And it took me back, when he made that comment, it took me back to when I first went to UWI, and my first job in UWI back in 1973, when I was the business surveys editor at the Central Statistical Office. And the comments which were being made in relation to the difficulty in... Hello?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
So the comment took me back then, and I remember the challenges in relation to obtaining data from business entities. And one of the reasons why we were successful in those days in getting all of the business information was because of the passion and leadership of the English lady who ran the CSO in those days. And we were sent out from the social sciences department. We got jobs, and we were sent out to do business service edits. And it's through those efforts and going to all of the companies, we were able to get complete data on all of the issues and elements that was being sought. And we have the same issues. And I take umbrage to the fact that Professor Hussein is make these comments without understanding that he has a leadership role, especially the economics department, where data is so important for all of their analysis, and not championing that cause to force the government and all the powers to be, like in the days of Erickson, Sear and these people, Professor Thomas and these people, who would champion the need for proper data collection. And now you criticize the government, but there's no effort to mobilize the population to ensure that it is done. So leadership is the crisis we have in Trinidad, right through. The leadership in terms, you must have passionate people to lead these organizations. The EMA must have somebody who's passionate about the aspects of the environment. But we have people who we put there for whatever purposes they're nominated. We have people who put in Minister of National Security with no passion for security. We have people who run the police service with no passion for getting the job done. And this is the crisis we have in Trinidad. There's a crisis of leadership in every aspect of the operations of the country. From the central bank come down, everyone, there's a lack of passion to get anything done, right? And this is where we're suffering. And it's unfortunate. So I fault the UWI in particular because they're not focusing on developing this aspect of the character of the graduates that they're producing. So that's it. Thank you.
Darrell, what's your speaker name, Darrell?
Jimmy Chankit.
Yeah, so Jimmy, thank you for your comment. I can tell you that after I raised the National Statistical Institute discussion and the need for the National Statistical Institute to come on stream about 100,000 times, I became quite tired. But now that you have raised it again, I will try to push it again, not as Dewey, simply as myself, and I saw Terence brought it up. It's something that we repeatedly bring up year in, year out, but we take your little nudge and we will continue the battle in the best ways that we can. And that's an honest response.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Terence, you want to add anything to that? Or?
No. I think I want to agree with Roger's previous comment and his comment on the NSI problem. Yeah.
I see what we pretty much over time. So any closing remarks from Dr. Hussein and Dr. Farrell? I think Mala had exited.
Yeah, I will let Terence go first.
Okay.
I guess so.
No, so I think in summary, what I would say is that I think Mala has identified an important problem, and I think that we must commend her for raising the issue. It's the bigger issue that she's raised is the whole issue about data collection, and the need for good, timely data to support good policy making. That's absolutely critical. She's put her finger on the problem of the net errors and omissions, the balance of payments. That's important because your external account tells you it's like the beating heart of the economy. It's the lens through which you understand what is going on in an economy like Trinidad and Tobago. So she's put her finger on a very important issue, I think, which needs to get the attention of the authorities, which I think that it is, because the authorities we are talking about in this circumstance is in fact the central bank, who are responsible for preparing the balance of payments. My feeling is that they are seized of the problem. As I said, I haven't spoken to them, but I think that they are. I want to feel that the guys down there are still as diligent and as competent as back in the day. But it's a difficult problem that they're dealing with. It's one that is going to require the cooperation of the business community in terms of responding to the surveys and so on. It may require, I don't know to what extent that they may be able to tap into the commercial banks to be able to, let me not put that suggestion. That's going to be too much of an issue. But you can't replicate the EC1 system in today's world. So I would end there to say that I think that Malaha's survey is a very important issue, but I think that the conclusions that she drew were a bit, how should I put it, sensational, if you like. I think they were kind of over the top, and they led to a certain kind of speculation about what is going on, when I think that's really not what the problem is. That in fact, most of those flows, in my view, relate to the services account and the $25 billion, which is missing, not missing at all. We've already spent it and consumed it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Terence. Roger?
Yeah, so thanks. What I would close in saying is that, yes, we have some data issues in Trinidad and Tobago. There's no denying that. But there's also a wide cadre, a wide block of data that is easily available as well on the labor force participation rate that is declining, on the underemployment rate that is rising, on the unemployment rate that is rising, on murder levels that are increasing. There are so many blocks of data that you could easily pull down, and that is there for the policymakers to look at, where there are opportunities to see how badly we are doing, how we can fix it, and how we move forward. And so we shouldn't use the data smoke screen as a place to inhibit the way we move forward, or to reduce the type and nature of intervention that we make. Because I look at the available data all the time, and in my understanding of the facts, the data is there from the review of the economy, from the annual economic survey, from the IMF reports, from the CSO reports that come out, and in combination with the central bank online database, there are ton loads of data. And therefore, we need to look at this data, and we need to be honest in our assessment of the economy and intervene, because a lot of our problems, in my opinion, are endogenous and fixable. So I thank you for the time and opportunity to speak.
Thank you. I do apologize to those who we did not get to their questions, or we did not get to get some opinions or some, messaging from the presented panelists. Roger, you might have to have another part two to this.
No problem. We could
Yes.
arrange.
It certainly stirred up a lot of conversation. I would like to thank both of you. I would like to thank the three of you all for agreeing to present, and recognize Mrs. Gookool-Bosland for all of her support in terms of the background, making sure that things are running, keeping track of everything. And so we would, I know it's over time, so I do thank the audience for staying with us and asking questions and making comments. And I would like to recognize the entity TEDU for putting together this this particular session. I know that you have it every Friday, Roger, or?
Yeah, once a month on a Friday evening.
Once a month on a Friday, so you can look forward to more of these seminars, so that you would be, kept abreast of the realities of Trinidad and Tobago. And from what we know, data is really a challenge, even for the research that we do. So it's something that You know, I think the CSO probably has 2 or 3 people in there. I don't know if they're still there, but the last I checked, data is available from CSO. They just have challenges in terms of what was indicated to me is that they don't really publish the data, but if you request it, you can get it. Right. So, and every time I requested, I've been able to get data from the CSO. It may not be current data, but it's still something to work with. So with that, I would again thank you all and have a good night.